Rice, co-executive director and co-founder of Liberation in a Generation. I'm joined by my co-executive director and co-founder, Jeremie Greer.
Hello.
We are talking about jobs and jobs quality today. We want to know what this COVID-19 pandemic and massive call for racial equity is ushering in for workers. And we are so pleased to have Erica Smiley, the Executive Director of Jobs with Justice, with us to break it all down.
Glad to be here.
Yes. Smiley is a longtime organizer and movement leader, has spearheaded strategic organizing and policy interventions with Jobs with Justice for nearly 15 years. Jobs with Justice creates solutions to the problems working people face by leading campaigns, changing the conversation, and moving labor, community, and student and faith voices to action. And you know what? They deliver real change at the national and local levels. They fueled campaigns like Change Walmart, Change the Economy, Caring Across Generations, Debt-Free Future, to name a few. Basically, they've got your back. So I'm really excited to talk to Smiley today. Let's just jump in with why have you dedicated your life and career to economic and racial justice, Smiley?
Well, that's a heck of a place to start, Solana. I'm really honored to be here, part of this idea of liberation in a generation, and appreciate kind of wanting to ground it in that question, despite the tall order. I grew up originally in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I didn't necessarily grow up in an activist household. My dad was a music professor at A&T State University. I keep crying. And my mom was a public servant, worked for the city of Greensboro in many different capacities, ending in public transportation. And so, I understood the context of the civil rights movement and Black freedom movements and things from them, and watching TV, and I watched Eyes on the Prize, probably too young to watch it, but I learned about that as a thing that it had happened, and had some vague sense that it was a thing that could happen, but was still generally just told to go to school and learn stuff and grow up and be a doctor or a lawyer or another character on the Cosby Show. And I didn't know what a union was, and I didn't necessarily know what the labor movement was. But fast forward, as a teenager, I was a part of a struggle with my church, actually, with St. James Presbyterian Church, where we were supporting a group of Black women who, as far as my teenage mind could understand, were experiencing discrimination, and it wasn't fair, and we were having their backs. We were boycotting Kmart. We were going out in solidarity. I didn't realize that was a union fight until I was much older, that they were organizing with Act Two. And I didn't realize until I was older how much that experience transformed me, because again, I never identified my household as an activist one, but when it was really needed, I discovered that we very much were a movement household. We were in solidarity with working people. So the long and short is that, growing up, I went through my own phases like we all do, but realized that at some point I didn't want to be known for just one identity. Like, yes, I was Black. Yes, I was Southern. Yes, I'm a woman. Yes, I'm queer. Yes, I'm many things. I wanted to try to fight for a democracy that would work for all of us. And me included, my family and my community included, in all the messiness that entails. And so it was at that point that I realized I wanted to transition from what I was doing at the time and begin to work with workers. And ironically, the first labor union organizing gig I had was working with Black women in Baltimore, similar to the Black women who had initially trained me on these questions of dignity and respect. And so that's really the long and short of how I got involved. I think, the final thing I'll say about it is that, my mom told me a story once. It feels like I can't believe I'm 40 years old, so I guess it's 22 years ago. When I was leaving my grandmother's funeral, when I was leaving North Carolina, I was this hotshot activist trying to go off and become, famous or whatever in the movement. I was definitely clear on that at that point. But when we were driving away, she was really clear. She said, sometimes the people who need your help most are the ones you've left behind. And that really stuck with me because I very clearly feel like the work that I do, if it's not going to impact, my uncle who's, disabled and unemployed, or my diabetic aunt, if it's not going to impact people that I know who I'm super close to, then that's not, I wouldn't be on purpose. So in that sense, I feel very, I guess that's why I joined this movement.
Let's dive into talking about jobs. The United States, we've got this kind of stubborn trend, it seems, where Black unemployment is always kind of double that of white unemployment. Latinx unemployment is always higher than white unemployment. And this is kind of something that's tracked as long as we've been counting the number of jobs and kind of unemployment rate. That's kind of been the trend that we've been on. And, recently, the recent job numbers came out and, in the middle of a pandemic, unemployment went down overall. And, Donald Trump threw a party on Twitter, the unemployment rate's going down. But what he failed to acknowledge was that Black unemployment actually went up during that time. I was wondering, as you think about the labor market and jobs, and as you do your work, what kind of data, stories, information are you tracking to kind of get a good grounding and understanding of what the labor market looks like for people of color?
I wish I was like an economist when you ask a question like that, because they have lots of stats and data that clearly disprove everything that Trump and the Trump administration have said about unemployment.
But I asked you because you aren't an economist.
There is something about our experience making us the expert. I think there are many indicators that we should look at. The fact that the COVID-19 pandemic, if you look at those statistics and the number of Black and brown people who succumbed particularly to extreme cases and passed away. We just launched a workers' memorial wall yesterday where, you could put up the co-workers who are missing now that we're all beginning to slowly trickle back into work. And they're mostly Black and brown faces, mostly Black, if I'm being honest. And that's an indicator of something. And so there are a couple of different ways to look at it. So from one perspective, we have people who are working, who are deemed essential, but are not necessarily being cared for in those essential jobs. When you have an essential structure, like the essential beam of a house or the engine of a car, you take care of those structures. You get an oil change. When you're doing some renovation or whatever, you don't mess with that beam. There are things that you do to make sure that the essential parts are doing well and are thriving. And we haven't, as an economy, done that for essential workers. And many, many, many of the jobs that are held by Black people, jobs in low-wage sectors like food service, retail and grocery work, and even jobs that have historically created a pathway towards sustainability, economic sustainability, like public sector jobs, public transit. We as a society and as an economy have not taken care of them, of that essential job. And so the level of access to healthcare, how expensive it is to have healthcare, contributes then to how quickly someone might have sought help when they could have gotten treated earlier for COVID-19 or for anything else for that matter. Retirement income, if they have it at all, then what's the safety net that's going to support them? And if they're getting extremely low wages over the course of multiple decades, what does that mean for their Social Security afterwards and taking care of their families? So it creates this cycle of inequality Black workers and for their families, and also creates a sense of desperation. And so, the question you asked was around unemployment, jobless workers, and I intentionally talked about it in relationship to essential workers, because even many of people in these essential workforces were laid off, and then, a handful kept. And so, you have this very difficult tension or decision to either expose your family and work, or to not expose your family and figure out how you're going to pay for anything and everything. And so so that creates a climate of desperation where people really want to work, but also want, and that benefits, a set of very wealthy executives who need people to be desperate to work for pennies and expose themselves without a lot of support, so that they can continue to make money. They call it keep the economy running, but we know it means really just make money for them.
Right.
So, I think those are some of the key indicators we have been paying attention to. How many workers have, insisted on rent forgiveness or protection and moratorium from evictions. We've got a lot of companies now putting up Black Lives Matter on their website, like Amazon, corporate landlords like, Equity Realty and whatever these companies. Meanwhile, they're, going to evict Black workers after the moratorium's in July. They'll be the first ones to send a letter. Amazon fired the one Black worker who was pushing them to have personal protective equipment and to practice better practices to support workers who were essential in this moment from getting COVID. And, you've got thousands of cases amongst workers in Amazon warehouses, many Black, many brown workers. So all of that is to say that having a population of workers that are consistently, chronically underemployed, unemployed many times of the year, right? Like it used to be that you would have a job and every now and then you might get laid off, but then brought back, right? There was like that theory of work. Whereas now for many Black workers, you don't have a job. Every now and then you have a job that might be formal, but for the most part, you don't. So there's something about this chronic unemployment and underemployment that, and particularly having a segment of the population of Black people, the population, to fill that group of chronically underemployed people, that benefits a set of companies. It creates a culture of desperation and need for economic sustainability to where you might be willing to take less. It also hurts white workers and others who then, in fighting for pay raises, can't, because there's always a population of people who are able to work for less. And the same is true when you talk about migrant workers, immigrant workers, guest workers, undocumented workers. The same cycle becomes true with people, with companies benefiting from people who are desperately set up to work for less, right? So that's kind of the I guess anecdotal evidence that we've been looking at Jobs with Justice. And I guess the one thing I will say that is maybe a positive benefit of it in this moment, which is unique for many reasons, is that we've been in this huge compression moment around the pandemic, and then the uprising surrounding the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and we got all these folks who aren't working and who have been stuck, sheltering in place, many in tight places. Like, of course there are uprisings,
That's right.
like at some point you just can't sit at home and hope for the best anymore. It's like, and so to that degree, it's been a really powerful moment for our movement to break through and try to reimagine the politics of the possible, not just to ask for things like unemployment insurance and relief, but actually to create a society where any economic stimulus comes with the stipulation that you have to keep people on payroll first and foremost, or that you have to put money in people's retirement, or that you have to provide for people's health care, not just if they get sick, but during this period, during the duration, that you don't have to pay rent in this duration. Like the things that many of us have been fighting for many years are now being blown open by a movement that is, completely outside of our control in some ways, which is great. So in that sense, it's also a hopeful moment for us and for organizing unemployed and jobless Black workers.
Yeah, I want to dig in a little bit because you mentioned how corporates actually profit from making workers vulnerable. And I wonder if you could dig in, what are some of the tactics that you all have seen in your organizing where these large multinational corporations are intentionally doing things to really make the workers that they employ or the ones that they may employ in the future very particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of tactics. So first and foremost is the limiting and fighting against and aggressively, sometimes violently fighting against workers' ability to organize and have collective voice on the job. And so, whether we're talking about the institutions of unions who are the ones who essentially do that negotiating, or even what's been much more sporadic, spontaneous, not necessarily connected worker actions and walkouts over the last few months during the pandemic, the corporations are aggressive at preventing workers from being able to collectively have that voice, because that's where really our strength comes from on any given work site. If you get enough people to stop production or to control the labor market, then they have nothing. So the company's squashing of organizing collective bargaining power is one tactic that we've seen over the last couple of decades that has weakened our strength as a movement and made it harder for us to do it. Luckily, particularly for most Black folks, we very rarely wait for laws to be in our favor to do what we need to do. We'll break unjust laws, so people are doing it anyway. And so, the next thing is when we think about the state protections, the government protections on workers, those have been significantly weakened. So you have this problem with at-will employment. If a boss or an executive or manager can fire you at will with no explanation, the burden is on you to prove that they discriminated or whatever. But otherwise you have no recourse, and it may take years, and it's expensive, and when are you going to get that money back? So that's a problem, right? So we try to fight for things that many unions negotiate for in their contract, which is just cause. You have to prove that you're firing workers with just cause. The onus and the burden then goes on the employer, not on the worker to prove it. So that's another thing. Really, essentially decriminalize the behavior of workers, criminalize the behavior of employers when it comes to and hold them accountable to these standards. And then last, and probably not last, but just in terms of conversation, but last that comes to mind for me are companies like Amazon and Walmart really have thrown away all laws that would prevent monopolies, right? Have fought against these laws. So they come in and make it very difficult for other businesses that might be able to pay better or have more of a connection with the community and want to be more accountable to the community. Make it very difficult for those companies to exist by buying up all the supplies and cornering the market on whatever it is, grapes, cribs, diapers, and essentially making themselves the only job in town. And so that creates another sense of desperation where you got to work, you got to feed your kid. What are you going to do? You got to go work at the Amazon warehouse. They're offering $11 an hour. At least that's better than McDonald's, which is offering $5, or $5.25. So that's again, when I talk about this culture of desperation, that's how these systems kind of line up to create this climate. And it has residual impacts. I mean, we talk about a moment when people are talking about police unions and corrections officers, and there are people who are like, this is the only good job in town, otherwise I got to work at McDonald's or Walmart. That's a residual impact of what happens when you create that type of climate and economy. Then you make it easier for people to make choices that they might not otherwise make based on their values.
Can you share your vision and on how some of the immediate relief efforts and things like the unemployment councils and the gig councils, what is the work of Jobs with Justice right now, especially in the immediate crisis moment, but also shifting economic paradigms and power?
First and foremost, there's an opportunity presented by the reopenings and what we suspect will also be potentially a second wave of the virus. And so there's an opportunity for essential workers to get ahead of that and just to try to mandate standards for reopening and for the shelter in place that might come after that. So, the question becomes, what would it look like for nurses and care workers, or, retail workers, restaurant and food service workers, to be able to negotiate both with the state as well as the industry over conditions for what that looks like. What are the total number of people you can have in a square footage? What are the protocols if someone gets sick? To negotiate some enforceable agreements around that we currently don't have so far. And within doing that, they're also essentially negotiating for the community, right? Because if retail workers are safe, if the grocery workers are safe, we're less likely to pick up something when we're out buying diapers, right? So that's one particular strategy that I think will be very valuable. And because essential workers have more, in some ways, leverage, right, than they have, say, when they were just low-wage workers a year ago, then that's the opportunity to try to insert themselves into this conversation in a very different way. What's also interesting about that is that it could create a platform for essential workers in any given sector for negotiations over industry standards more broadly. So once we get a practice of negotiating, of talking through standards, and you realize we're not scary on the other side, right, then we can start talking about other issues too, and certainly not in lieu of places where we actually have unions and where we can collectively bargain directly with the company. But in addition to, we can try to set standards for the industry that would support all workers, even those who, for whatever reason, haven't been able to organize into a union at this point. So those sectoral strategies feel promising. And then the last piece of it, which is important and speaks to this conversation around unemployment, is can we also do this in a way to where people who are currently jobless from those sectors, right? So I might be a nurse but I got laid off, or I'm a retail worker but I got laid off, to relate to the negotiations that are happening amongst the workers who are still working and negotiating with the industry, to be a part of those negotiations, so that we're negotiating around, not just what the state provides for unemployed workers, stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, the social safety net, but that we're also negotiating over what the industry does for jobless and unemployed workers that have been recently laid off from those sectors, from companies in those sectors. And what that kind of does, if we can do it well, it creates a synergy between those who have leverage who are still working and those who can come together and actually create a bigger demand around the social safety net more broadly. And so that's really what we're hoping to create is a very symbiotic relationship between jobless workers and essential workers, to approach it a little more scalpularly by sector and not just assume we can create a mass movement and everyone will come running, but to be a little more intentional about how we relate to folks and how the issues of an unemployed construction worker might be very different than the issues of an unemployed food service worker, and to then be intentional about how we relate the demands of both in a cohesive way.
Wow, that's exciting work. So one thing that we at Liberation Generation believe really deeply is that, since really the first colonizers arrived in this country, that racism has been profitable and you talked a bit about that, right? It's been a profitable endeavor to build a racist system that excludes and really harms people of color, that it's a system built on theft, exclusion, exploitation, and really meant to drive resources and wealth towards the elite. And we call that what we've come to call that as oppression economy, that we have an economy that is built on racial oppression. And what we want to do is move, of course, to a economy, what we call liberation economy, that centers the well-being of people of color, where people of color can thrive. And I wonder, from your standpoint, what would it take to make that shift, particularly as it relates to workers and kind of the labor market?
So we have an economy and an economic structure that is constantly trying to maximize profit and minimize costs. And so if completely unregulated, it would automatically try to get to a place where people were working for free or close to free again, and justify it in different ways. And we see this already when it comes to the use of prison labor, the arguments that are made around guest workers coming into the country to work for industries that say we couldn't exist if we didn't have this guest workforce. Well, then maybe you shouldn't exist. You know, if your business, if you can't pay rent, if you can't, you know, bring in the equipment you need to do something, then you can't actually run a business. But these arguments have now like made up reasons for why people are able to exploit workers. So that's the first thing, this just kind of like deep embeddedness of white supremacy in our economic structure. And so for us, it's both core, like we won't actually win democracy in the economic arena, or what you call liberation economy, without defeating the systems of white supremacy. It's not just like the morally right thing to do, like in solidarity, but that we actually won't win without doing it. And we've seen this. Just like during you know, the McDonald's struggle, you know, Fox News, you heard them say things like you know, companies should be able to pay workers what they want. Should they? Well, now we're hearing that, you know, again, like in the current struggles, when we're thinking about not only what is the value of work and the nature of work and the million conversations about the future of work, but this question of value, period, of givers and of takers, right? I think, you know, another example where maybe we didn't do it as well was in the Nissan campaign, where UAW was organizing workers at Nissan in Mississippi, overwhelming majority Black workforce, but didn't want to make it an issue, or at least as aggressive an issue as just the fact that this was the only plant, this one and one in Tennessee, were the only plants in the company's entire chain around the globe that weren't union. And they also happened to be the only plants that were majority Black and based in the US South. Didn't want to make that the issue, and the fact that the majority of people who I think or the primary market for the Ultima, I think it was at the time, was an urban market between 18 and 25. I mean, to me, it was like an easy campaign. If we were ready to go hard for that, you know what I mean? We were like, oh, hell no, you know? But no, they wanted to stick to the economic issues and stick to this, you know, some of these bigger questions. And they lost. They lost the election in 2009. The right did a really good job of scaring them. There were literally radio, right-wing talk radio stations that were telling them if they didn't shut up, they would just go right back into the cotton fields. This was 2017 maybe. This was not a long time ago. So anyway, we see what happens when we don't centralize the struggle against white supremacy and whatever. Like, the unions involved in both campaigns, I'm sure, have much more nuanced agreements or arguments for what they were doing and whatever. But just for my humble opinion, I think those are just two really solid examples of what happens when you center race or don't.
It's my hope, and I think Jeremie agrees, that the energy we're seeing in the streets and the uprisings and the calls for justice will translate to long-term systems change that really confronts what you just said, white supremacy and oppression. You spoke about the politics of what is possible, the politics of possible. And I'm wondering, what's giving you hope right now? What's giving you life?
I live in a very small town that's majority white, and they had the first Black Lives Matter demonstration this weekend, organized by local high school students, one of whom is Black. You know, all 17 of us were there. And 2,000 people showed up from our community, which is not small, or, you know, for our town. And that gave me a great deal of hope. I definitely felt held and seen in a different way. but also the fact that it wasn't a city. I mean, ever since Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, you know, I'd always kind of lamented, I guess I'll do my own vigil and, you know, walk around my neighborhood with a candle and hope for the best, you know. But for this to happen in my town and the town north of us and the town south of us, knowing that it wasn't called by some national entity, but actually, you know, organized locally, very authentically, and all of its messiness, was uplifting. And so, you know, it kind of gets me through the daily torments, the daily horrors that we're witnessing, things that would have been like a year's worth of conversation, you know, few years ago are now, you know, just daily things that happen. That Fox News thinks that the stock goes up when Black people are murdered. Yeah, that happened. You know, Trump took a picture with the Bible in front of a church without permission. That happened too. You know, to try to manage the what keeps coming at us, it's nice to be able to hold on to those moments of resilience and solidarity and transformation. So that's what I've been doing. And but I want to be transparent, particularly for the people I will assume, you know, are watching this, is that it is legitimately hard. It is qualitatively hard what we're going through right now. And yet, you know, we should never underestimate how quickly things can change, for the better and for the worse. And so, you know, acknowledging that we are experiencing some level of a collective trauma and that we should all, you know, pace ourselves, not stop fighting, but pace ourselves and take care of ourselves in this moment so that we can win. And I believe we can win.
Smiley, you are so on point. I so appreciate you and the work that you are doing and all the people that you are holding down in your town.
We're doing
it. Thank you for joining us. And share with the viewers how they can support Jobs with Justice.
Oh, absolutely. So the first thing you should do, especially in this moment, is go to jobswithjustice.org and click on the Worker Solidarity Fund. It's one of the few funds that gives money to people who may fall through the cracks when it comes to federal stimulus and other forms of support, undocumented workers, formerly incarcerated workers, the families of incarcerated workers. And so our fund is also governed by a set of workers who've been in some of these campaigns with us. So that's another difference. It's not just a charity, but actually it's active solidarity. So that's one way to contribute. Another thing you can do if you are a worker is go to the workersmemorialwall.org and actually just say their name. I mean, this is a thing, we're human, you know, and it's hard to keep fighting without also grieving what we've lost. And aside from what we considered normal before, we've lost a lot of people, like real human beings and coworkers that we couldn't grieve, maybe because we aren't family. We couldn't go to there's no memorial garden, there's no place for us to walk and put flowers down. So we created this online Workers Memorial Wall to support people, to lift up the photos and names of stories of their coworkers who may have been lost to COVID-19, and eventually we hope to expand that also to coworkers who are lost to racial and police violence. So those are two immediate things you can do. We have an event where we'll be talking about all of these things. Black leaders from our network, from different unions and other parts of our movement will be speaking on June 17th, speaking to this moment. And that's another thing that's going to be free, live, online, YouTube Live, that you can go to our website and click through to. It should be an interesting discussion, and we're not going to say that we have all the answers, but we will at least give you a sense of how we're thinking about it and how, you know, provide some insight as to how you might be grappling as well. So those are 3 concrete ways that you can continue to support what we're doing.
Thank you. That is fabulous, Smiley. I hope you are giving me hope and keeping me going today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys. Appreciate it, Solana. Thank you, Jeremy.